Leaders of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Trade Group meet virtually in New Zealand. On the agenda, climate change, trade and the region's economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu and this is The Heat. Ministers from the 21 APEC member economies are gathering virtually this week to accelerate the region's response to the global health and economic crises. The group, which includes China, Russia and the United States, accounts for about 38% of the world's population and more than 60% of its GDP. CGTN's Owen Poland has more from Auckland, New Zealand.
As the host of APEC 2021, New Zealand says the Asia-Pacific region is at a turning point in its history, and the 21 member economies must work together to leave a lasting legacy for future generations. Considerable progress has been made during the year on opening up vaccine supply chains and also improving the flow of essential goods and services. And New Zealand's Trade Minister says the APEC must send a powerful message to the region and to the world about the importance of free and fair trade, especially when they're facing the biggest economic shock in 75 years. Damien O'Connor has also stressed the importance of openness when it comes to economic integration. Now is not the time, he says, to turn inward or away from each other, which is obviously a pushback against the protectionism that has begun to emerge since COVID struck in 2020. Two of the other key priorities for APEC 2021 are the promotion of sustainability and increased inclusion. Minister O'Connor says APEC needs to send a clear message that it recognises climate change and decarbonisation as increasingly urgent issues. And he says if we want to leave a safe, sustainable and prosperous region for future generations, then APEC economies must work to safeguard what they have now. In addition to discussing a contentious standstill agreement for fossil fuel subsidies, the ministers have also directed officials to create what could become a world-first list of environmental services, like the installation and repair of solar panels, which will help to lower the cost and increase the uptake of environmentally friendly products. Last but not least, the APEC ministers are being urged by New Zealand to make sure that the economic recovery from COVID must be truly inclusive, so that no one is left behind. It's been estimated that the Asia-Pacific region is losing up to $100 billion every year by its failure to fully integrate women into the workforce. And there's also a big emphasis on recognising the economic contribution of the 270 million Indigenous people across the region. Owen Poland, CGTN, Auckland.
There is much to talk about. Let's get straight to our panel. Rajiv Biswas is Executive Director and Asia-Pacific Chief Economist at IHS Markit, a business consulting firm. Also with us is Jeff Moon. He served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China Affairs and currently heads China Moon Strategies, a consulting firm based right here in Washington, D.C. And joining us from Beijing is political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Einar Tangen, APEC leaders want to increase regional cooperation. As I said, they represent 38% of the world's population, 60% of the world's GDP. So at a time like this, when many parts of the world are having supply chain problems, we see COVID spikes in some parts of the world as well. How important is this gathering?
Well, it's very important given that not much was accomplished at COP26 or the G20, very disappointing. It's kind of interesting that one of the smallest nations, New Zealand, is hosting this, and they seem to have the most pragmatic approach to it. Obviously, tremendous amounts of dissension among the members, especially right now, U.S., Russia, China. Russia is not agreeing to the U.S. hosting the next one, 23, not next one, the one after. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these political fractures pay out when it comes to the actual work that needs to be done. Some people believe that Biden is trying to pursue the optics of leadership as opposed to the actual actions that are necessary to accomplish things.
So, Einar, as far as this gathering is concerned, are you optimistic that there will be something concrete that will come out of it?
I'm not optimistic. Let's all hope that something does. The standstill agreement would be very interesting, but obviously there'd be a tremendous amount of work. If that was going to be something that was going to be accomplished, it would have been discussed at COP26 and G20. So you see a lot of meetings, but it's not clear that a lot of progress is going. And along with that 60% GDP, remember, these members also are responsible for 60% of the carbon emissions.
Rajiv, APEC members account for something like 3 billion people, but they also lost 80 million jobs during the pandemic. Of course, the delegates to this conference, they want to stem those losses, and one of the ways they're looking at doing that is to build on growth. They want to remove tariffs, which has put a brake on growth as well. What do you think needs to be done? What more needs to be done to boost growth?
I think a focus of this particular APEC summit will be on the recovery out of COVID. And in that area, I think a key issue is how to move forward in terms of renormalizing movement of people, because I think one of the biggest areas of loss is things like tourism. You've got very strict border controls still in place in most of the APEC countries, which is quite a contrast, say, to the EU, where there's been a lot of easing of movement of people within Western Europe. So I think when we look at the situation of the APEC countries right now, a very big challenge to getting back to more normal conditions for business travel, for tourism, is trying to find a template for that kind of movement of people. And I think that's a very big problem, because right now everything's being done on a bilateral basis. Mm-hmm. Every country in the APEC region is pursuing its own approach. So you don't have that kind of framework that's being used in the Western European context. So I think that's an area where a lot of work needs to be done between the APEC economies to try to move into this phase of opening up borders, because there's been an estimated $1.2 trillion of lost economic activity in the APEC economies. A lot of that is jobs around tourism, retail trade linked to tourism. And so there's been millions of jobs lost in that. And so trying to get that back to normal is a huge challenge for the year ahead.
Jeff Moon, the Biden administration wants a more open international trade environment, but many of those tariffs that were put in place by the Trump administration are still there. They're still being enforced. Do you see any signs that that could change in the near future?
Well, I think it's important to understand what APEC is and APEC is not. Mm-hmm. I'm a bit more optimistic than, say, Einar is. It's Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, so it's about the economy. It is a large organization, but it's driven by consensus. It has a component and involves government people, but also the business community has a significant role. Most of the things that come out of APEC are non-binding. This is not like the WTO or a decision-making organization. And so the best role for APEC is really as an incubator for new ideas, best practices. You know, TPP came out of informal discussions at APEC. APEC has been addressing things like COVID by trying to introduce new best practices in terms of paperless customs processes for medical equipment, things like that. So they are not going to be talking about tariffs or the trade war, but they're going to be talking more about how they can work together on a consensus basis to fill gaps that are not filled by other organizations or by other efforts.
But Jeff, isn't the tariffs relevant to these countries? I mean, a lot of these things are bilateral issues, but wouldn't they be relevant to the group as a whole?
Sure. I mean, they're relevant, I think, particularly to China more than anything else. But every country has tariffs, and there are tariff negotiations that are going on. With China, it's bilateral. And with other countries, it's in other venues. But APEC is not a place to get binding commitments on things like tariff, because it's a consensus organization by definition.
Okay, at this point, let's welcome Ambassador Jorge Heine to the conversation. He is a research professor at Boston University and former Chilean ambassador to China Ambassador, great to have you with us. Let's continue with the conversation. Many of the...
Good to see you.
Great to see you as well, sir. Many of the countries in APEC represent powerhouse economies, if we look at this group. So what, in your view, are the biggest challenges that the group faces?
Well, I think APEC is facing a bit of an existential challenge. In 2018, President Trump did not attend the meeting held in Papua New Guinea. In 2019, the APEC summit was cancelled at the last minute. It was supposed to be held in Santiago, Chile. In 2020, it took place virtually. It is now taking place virtually again. It seems to me, it has a bit of a problem. And Einar Tangen mentioned the issue about the 2023 summit. There are some objections to holding it in the US. So this is an entity that has contributed much to the growth of trade and around the Pacific basin, but it is facing a problem now. And it seems to me it is important that this meeting in New Zealand come up with some strong statements. Otherwise, people will start looking at APEC as an entity that is fading. So I'm very concerned about it. In Chile, we believe very strongly in APEC. We think it is an important organization, but it is facing a bit of a problem.
Einar Tangen, what are your thoughts on that? Is APEC facing an existential problem?
Yes, and for some of the reasons that Jeff mentioned, I mean, it is a very powerful entity once people say, look, we all agree, there's a consensus about this, and you can go forward. I disagree about this idea that tariffs are somehow unconnected. They're very much connected, and it's not just a China problem, it's a US problem. There's been studies that have been made, 95% of the cost of tariffs are on US consumers, and this is at a time when inflation is running away from us. So, this is not something where it's, some countries are floating above. This is a joint problem, and this is where APEC should be a powerhouse in bringing people together. But, if you're not going to see, strength in APEC if you don't have some sort of, alignment at the G20 and COP26. These are all important meetings, and they have to be done. But I definitely agree with Jorge that this is an existential issue for APEC. If the U.S. continues to ignore it, it's going to be very difficult to go on. In terms of the framework of doing the, opening up borders, I think we're not talking about the real issue here, which is making sure that vaccine is distributed. If everyone in these countries was at about 85 to 90% vaccinated, yes, then you can have a framework for traveling around. But treating this idea and saying that Europe has it, yes, Europe is also going to experience, according to latest studies, about 500,000 additional deaths in the next few months. So, I mean, this idea that you lead by economics and, that people be damned, I think is the wrong way. I think China has taken a different approach. And I think in the long run, that will be justified.
Okay, I want to talk a bit more about the vaccine issue in a moment. But first, Jeff Moon, I mean, we've been hearing there that APEC is facing something of an existential crisis right now, which I guess points to its relevance. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I couldn't disagree more. And I think that APEC is important for all the reasons that I said before. APEC is not the WTO. It is not the WHO. It is not a substitute for U.S.-China bilateral trade negotiations. It is what it is. It is a grouping of 21 economies in Asia with 60% of the world's GDP that can help resolve various problems. So, as one of the previous speakers says, one of the great issues is resuming travel and communication through the area. Also addressing COVID by relaxing customs regulations, incubating new trade ideas. APEC is not 1 week or one meeting. It is a year-long series of meetings and exchanges between the business community and officials to exchange best practices and come up with practical solutions. So it is not a panacea. It does not solve all things, but considered where it is, it's still very valuable. And instead of it being virtual this year being seen as a weakness, I see that as a sign of its resilience. In fact, the ability of New Zealand to carry this all on virtually is amazing. There is still a limitation by virtue of the fact that people can't meet in person and you don't have the same people-to-people contact. I participated in APEC as both a U.S. official and a U.S. businessman, and it's the people-to-people contact that are the most important part. but they pressed on nonetheless and will nonetheless be relevant.
Rajiv, I want to talk a little bit more about the vaccine issue. Finance ministers from APEC, they've agreed to step up vaccine efforts to expand COVID-19 manufacturing and supply, and also to support global vaccine sharing right now. Now, the WHO has called the inequality in vaccine distribution, they've called it vaccine apartheid. Developed countries, we know, are buying more vaccines than they need right now, which in turn is squeezing the supply to developing countries. And what kind of impact is this going to have on the global economic recovery?
That's a crucial question. And I think in the beginning, I think I want to highlight that the Asia-Pacific region, many of the APEC member economies have made tremendous progress since June in boosting their vaccination levels. We're now seeing many of the Asia-Pacific economies in Southeast Asia and also countries like South Korea, Japan, have gone from having very low vaccination rates back in June to now being amongst the global leaders. So there has been very, very good progress amongst many of the Asia-Pacific economies. But I think the big problem that still exists, if we look globally, is that many low-income countries, particularly in Africa, are having very, very low levels of vaccination. So I think there's been great progress in the Asia-Pacific. I think Asia-Pacific economies or APEC economies can do a great deal now to work within the countries in the Asia-Pacific region that are still at very low vaccination rates to try and boost their situation. But we've already seen a lot of that kind of assistance happening amongst the APEC economies helping each other. For example, some of the low-income countries in ASEAN, such as Laos and Cambodia, have now reached very high vaccination rates, even though they're low-income countries. So I think the focus needs to now be on how to boost vaccination rates in other regions, particularly in Africa. And I think there, many of the APEC economies have an important role to play because, you know, the US, Russia, India, China are all major hubs of vaccine production for COVID vaccination. So I think those countries now have to play quite a big role in the next stage. They've already been doing a great deal. I don't want to understate that. But that needs to now ramp up and boost the vaccination rates in Africa in particular.
Do you think, Rajiv, there could be a bigger or greater flow of vaccines from the Asia-Pacific region to, say, places in like Africa or Latin America in the months ahead, rather than vaccines going from the United States or from Western Europe?
I think there already is quite a flow happening from China to help many other developing countries. India, because it was dealing with that huge surge in cases, diverted a lot of their domestic production that was intended for international use for dealing with that domestic pandemic, but now they've again resumed supplying for other developing countries, so that will help. But I think one fundamental issue, apart from China, India, US supplying vaccines to Africa and other developing countries, is a more medium-term issue, which is there needs to be more manufacturing capacity for vaccines in developing countries, hubs in many developing countries, especially in Africa, which doesn't have that much capacity, whereas Asian developing countries, obviously China and India, are global leaders in vaccine production. So I think the pandemic has highlighted that lack of capacity for manufacturing vaccines in many populous developing countries, and that's something that is an important policy issue that has already been discussed, and the US has certainly been talking about moving forward and helping.
Right.
The G7 has also indicated that it will be helping to boost that manufacturing capacity, but I think that's an urgent issue that needs to be addressed.
Ambassador Heine, let's talk a little bit about APEC and the battle against climate change. Now, APEC finance ministers have been meeting, and New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister Grant Robertson called on members to, quote, ensure sufficient capital was in place to drive a shift towards a low-carbon future. Ambassador, do you see that happening? You know, we've heard a lot of rhetoric in the past few months, in fact, the past few years, but do you see the rhetoric going beyond that into concrete action?
Well, not quite. One of the things I have heard is that what we need is less commitments, which are very common, you know, many years down the road, and more action. And we're not seeing more of that. You know, I mean, there's all this whole debate about, for example, infrastructure, which is often about highways. Highways, what they do is provide more carbon emissions. In fact, they're made for cars. So it's a whole new way of thinking that we need if we are really concerned about climate change. And I don't see much of that. I see very little sense of urgency about what is going to happen. And of course, climate change is happening now. It's not a question of 10, 20 years down the road. And I must say, I'm very concerned. I don't see a lot of action on that front. I see more of the same. I don't see it in Glasgow. I don't see it at the G20. I don't see it at APEC. And this is very worrisome. I mean, we have to face these global issues instead of focusing on, petty bilateral questions that often distract countries from the real issues humanity is facing.
Right, and of course, Ambassador, the other thing is that much of the funds that need to be raised will have to go to developing countries, to low-income countries.
Of course, and they don't have, the resources to address these issues, and they need to work together. And you were talking earlier about the issue of vaccines. It's much the same, Once again, the stark divide between North and South, between developed and developing countries, comes to the fore. And there's very little sense of the urgency of the situation, and they need to focus on that rather than on other issues.
Jeff, of course, the pandemic and climate change very high on the APEC agenda. Here's New Zealand's Minister for Trade and Export Growth, Damien O'Connor. Let's listen.
COVID-19 is a serious challenge, certainly. However, this does not mean we can focus on only one issue at a time. With our colleagues about to begin their discussions at the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, APEC must send a clear message that it recognises climate change and decarbonisation as increasingly urgent issues. If we want to leave a safe, sustainable and prosperous region for our future generations, we must work to safeguard what we have now. This will be our legacy.
So, Jeff, there's O'Connor saying that APEC must send a clear message that it recognises that climate change and decarbonisation are increasingly urgent issues. What can APEC do? I mean, we're just still having COP26 right now. How does APEC add to that effort?
Well, first of all, there will be a leader's statement at the end of these meetings, and I assume that there will be language in the leader's statements reinforcing the importance of that. But one of APEC's traditional roles, as I said before, is identifying best practices, sharing projects, pilot projects with other countries. That happens throughout the entire year. And it's especially useful for countries that don't have the innovative capacity to develop these kinds of projects on their own. And so sharing that kind of knowledge is what that series of meetings around the year is all about. And why, as I said before, the person-to-person contact is important, but that sharing and those pilot projects and that participation aspect also of the business community in the deliberations, that's what's going to carry that process forward.
Einar Tangen, China, of course, is one of the biggest economies in APEC. It's doing well in its economic recovery, but there's been some weakening that we've noticed recently. That's mainly due to a slowdown in the construction industry. But where do you see growth going now?
Growth is going to be very tough. I mean, with inflation rearing its head, debts outstanding, this combination of stimulus in developed countries and lack of anything in undeveloped countries is really going to drive more inequality. And, this idea that I'm going to agree with Ambassador Heine, this is not about best practices and things like this. That's all fine. The issue is money. It's about resources. These countries do not have them. They're saddled with debt. There's been no real, emphasis or progress on dealing with any of the bigger issues that are out there. And until you do that, you're not going to be able to address COVID and stabilize the world financial system, and you're certainly not going to be able to start talking about climate change. If I don't have food in my stomach, I do not worry about what carbon is going to be 20 years from now.
Right.
So it's about resources. The other thing is the elephant in the room is population. Over the last 50 years, we've doubled our population, adding 4 billion people. That is the driver of energy and all of these things. But I notice very little chat about that.
Rajiv, you recently tweeted some really interesting numbers. You tweeted that in 1990, the per capita GDP in Singapore was $12,500 compared to the per capita GDP in Western Europe, which at that time was $20,000. But by 2021, that number changed for Singapore to $65,000 per capita, $65,000 that is, and $46,000 for Western Europe. How was Singapore able to achieve that kind of growth and at the same time move to a greener economy?
Well, I think Singapore is in a special case, I think, when we look at the APEC economies, because it's quite small, it's got its own development model, and it's been able to create itself as a hub for finance. Over the last 30 years, it's become a global aviation hub, a headquartering hub. So there's certain characteristics of Singapore that has allowed it to achieve that tremendous economic progress and to become one of the richest countries in the world on a per capita basis. But I think if we look at more broadly what's happened in the Asia Pacific region and amongst the APEC developing economies, it's a broader picture of tremendous progress in the last 20 years. And, we can look at South Korea, for example, which also was one of the poorest countries in the world in the 1950s. And it's now got a per capita GDP that's above Spain and Portugal and on the same level as Italy. So that's also a very remarkable story of what's happened in some of the other parts of the APEC world. But I think one of the strengths of APEC as an institution is that it does bring together the private sector and the public sector on the issue of climate change. For example, the APEC Energy Ministerial also brings together the private sector on energy. So there's a lot of potential for innovation and sharing of ideas and raising of capital through these APEC forums because of the role of the private sector. So I do think that when we talk about transforming economies and this climate change approach of the energy transition, the move towards renewable energy, APEC does have a vibrant role to play going forward because of that private sector participation.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.